Sorry, where? Sorry.
I tried to enter into the room, and it was not possible. So, hey, I am the speaker. Okay.
Please sit down. We will open this session of Ideas Lab 2023. I am Joaquín Almunia, the chair of the board of CEPS since 6 or 7 years, and I am pleased to welcome all of you to Brussels and to the new Ideas Lab conference organized by CEPS, and this year is the 40th anniversary of the launch of CEPS. At that time, one of the few think tanks discussing European policies, and now I can say the stronger and bigger and broader think tank analyzing European policies, not only in Brussels, but in Europe. I am very pleased that you can attend this session of Ideas Lab for the first time. It's a full presential session since the times before the pandemic, and I look forward for you to enjoy the discussions and to interact with all the speakers in the different panels. I hope you will enjoy also taking this opportunity of your contact with CEPS to look into the impressive research that is being done by CEPS in the last times, in many areas, in many policy areas, from macroeconomics to external policies, to institutional, to the new technologies, energy and climate change, the new industrial policy, new digital transition. We are the think tank that has a broader view of the European policies, and we are very proud of the quality of our outcomes. And we try to use this opportunity to connect with all of you, showing what we can deliver and how you can teach us how to deliver better in the coming years with adequate priorities, with the right focus on the real challenges of the world we are living in these difficult times, but at the same time exciting times because of the new opportunities that are open with the new technologies, with the new changes in our world, with a more strategic view on what can be and what should be the role of the European Union to be influential and to provide adequate solutions to the challenges that our citizens are living. I will not spend much more time in these initial opening words of this session that will be moderated by Daniel Gross, one member of our board and distinguished fellow of CEPS for many years. The years where CEPS was founded, almost since the beginning, Daniel Gross and also Karel Lanoux were there, but I want to mention, before giving the floor to Daniel Gross and to the participants in the first panel, I want to mention the role of Peter Ludlow, that was the real founder of CEPS, and that asked me to communicate to you that unfortunately he cannot attend these initial discussions, but in any case, we need to be grateful for his original, seminal ideas to build a very powerful and I hope very interesting and successful think tank for the next 40 years also. Thank you very much for your presence, and now I give the floor to Daniel Gross that will present the participants in this first discussion of this Idea Lab 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman Almunia, for these kind words. This is now our 10th edition of the Ideas Lab, and I would submit to you that nobody of us would have thought that we would meet under the circumstances for Europe in which we are meeting today, with a war going on not that far from here on our continent, with untold suffering, destruction brought about by the Russian aggression on Ukraine. This is a very testing time for Europe. We have therefore chosen this title, Moving Europe from Darkness to Light, which I think everybody understands immediately given the situation. And it's also a challenge for Europe, which I think we have understood that Europe cannot really meet on its own. And that's why the transatlantic component, transatlantic alliance, has become even more important in this era. And this is therefore also reflected in our panel. We have some opening remarks by Don Graves, who is from the United States, Deputy Secretary of Commerce. If you already want to come join me on the stage. Arancha González Laya, Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. She insisted it's international, not global. And finally, Alexander Stubb, Director of the School of Transnational Governments at the European University Institute. I have not talked about all the other past positions, important positions, which our participants have had in the past. I thought that in the interest of our discussion, it would be useful to start immediately with the substance. And therefore, I would like to ask you, Don Graves, to start with your opening remarks. Many thanks.
Very important to stay hydrated. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to join CEPS, to be a part of this absolutely terrific program. Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. We've gathered here mere days after marking the one-year anniversary of Putin's brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. His land grab was a despicable act meant to divide the entire West, but instead, as we've all seen, was met with a wall of resistance from the brave people in Ukraine, as well as from America and our allies in Europe and around the world. What the past year has made clear is this: continued economic cooperation between the United States and the European Union is indispensable for growth and economic security on both sides of the Atlantic. It's also essential to ensuring that democracies prevail against authoritarians and malign actors. The economic partnership between the US and the EU rests on three pillars. Excuse me. First is our strategic economic alliance, which covers the broad efforts to harden our supply chains and to forge cooperation on issues like energy security and semiconductor production. Secondly, our shared defense against security threats, especially the threat of Russia's continued aggression. And third is the partnerships with countries beyond our respective borders. So let's discuss that first point, the US-EU Strategic Economic Alliance. It's our joint recognition that the concentration of resources in key supply chains can expose our economies to challenging disruptions. We've seen that over the course of the last 2 years, or 3 years. We know the United States can't make, mine, or grow everything, nor can Europe, or for that matter, anyone else. We need resilient, competitive supply chains that can withstand shocks, minimize disruptions, and respond effectively to crises when they occur. This means working collaboratively with our partners to promote greater supply chain diversification in areas including energy, technology, and semiconductors. Let's go through each of these one by one. On energy, we're working to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas and develop innovative clean energy projects together. A year ago, we established the US-EU Energy Security Task Force so that we could diversify supply and reduce energy demand. And we set ambitious targets for US liquefied natural gas, excuse me, or LNG, so that we could supply in both the short term and the long term. And last year, nearly 70% of total US LNG exports reached European markets, with approximately 57 billion cubic meters reaching the EU. That represents a major step forward. And one example of where we're working together to deploy clean energy is Poland's announcement that it will acquire technology for its first 3 nuclear power plants from a US-based company, Westinghouse. This deal cements the type of long-term partnership that I believe will help Poland achieve energy security while creating thousands of clean energy jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. When it comes to our shared leadership in technology, the US is pursuing a modern and proactive strategy that includes protections against bad actors and authoritarian regimes, as well as forging high-standard strategic partnerships with our friends and our partners, our allies here in Europe and elsewhere. Working with our partners here in Europe is crucial for this effort as we develop the shared rules of the road that align with our shared interests. We jointly created the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, or TTC, to help shape these rules. The TTC is a vital mechanism for transatlantic economic cooperation, and it serves as a regular forum to develop collaborative projects that further strengthen our shared tech leadership. You saw some of this collaboration around semiconductors late last year. In December, following the third ministerial meeting of the TTC, the two sides agreed to share information on public support in the semiconductor sector. As you might know, the U.S. Commerce Department's Chips for America program is investing more than $50 billion to revitalize our domestic semiconductor industry. And we recognize that coordination with our allies is necessary to our success. It's crucial for us all to avoid a subsidy race and oversupply, and we're engaging with our allies to promote collaboration as we jointly develop the next generation of microelectronic products and processes. The second pillar of our partnership is our defense against shared security threats. As President Biden said last week in Poland, when Russia invaded, it wasn't just Ukraine being tested. All democracies were being tested. The US-EU relationship has proven to be a bulwark against threats to our values, contributing to a safer, more democratic world. And in response to Russia's full-scale invasion, American support for Ukraine was immediate and unwavering, committing billions of dollars in security assistance to counter Russia's aggression. Along with allies and partners, we also imposed severe economic costs on Russia to hobble its war machine. Central to that effort is the unprecedented set of export controls we put in place at the U.S. Department of Commerce, which are hampering Russia's ability to sustain, repair, and resupply its military and industrial bases. This impact has relied on a multilateral approach. We can't do this, as I said before, we can't do this alone. In record time, we built a coalition of 39 like-minded partners from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, all of whom agreed that Russia's actions represented a global security threat that couldn't go unanswered. It's hard to overstate the significance of this. The pace and the depth of our multilateral alignment against Russia was unprecedented. Because of these export controls, Russia's imports of semiconductors or chips, the lifeblood of Russia's weaponry, has had a significant and sustained drop compared to the same period in 2021. Russia's military and its industrial economy is heavily reliant on outside sources for advanced semiconductors. And as a result, they've had to struggle to sustain, restore, and replace many of its weapon systems, including more than 9,000 pieces of military equipment that were destroyed over the last year. We can see firsthand how this has made things difficult for Putin's military. They're cannibalizing semiconductors from dishwashers, refrigerators, washing machines, and even electric breast pumps so that they can fix their military hardware. They're pulling these components apart to steal the chips and other microelectronics to use in their military complex. Russia's also turned to pariah states like North Korea and Iran to obtain artillery shells, rockets, and drones made with black market components. But we're not done. Multilateral efforts continue because the war continues. We're in constant and close contact, and we're always looking for ways to amplify our impact. Just a few days ago, in conjunction with our friends here in Europe, we announced new export controls that align more closely together, including on industrial goods and luxury goods. Our challenge going forward is to find new ways of restricting Russia's battlefield effectiveness and to increase our enforcement by catching evaders and backfillers. 2 months ago, the TTC reaffirmed the importance of cooperation on export controls, resolving to take additional steps to enhance enforcement collaboration. The EU and the US, working together, have since piloted an information exchange on Russian diversion tactics, and we're actively planning exchanges of best practices. We've met with many of our European counterparts over the last 2 days precisely to build on that progress. Now let me turn to the third pillar in our working relationship, and that's about working together to support partner countries and work with partner countries beyond our respective borders, and to promote a world economic order based on our shared democratic values, adherence to the rule of law, and the protection of human rights, worker rights, and against IP theft. That's what we're doing together under the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, or PGII, which will provide financing for high-standard, sustainable infrastructure in developing and middle-income countries. Late last year, President Biden joined President von der Leyen to announce a range of new PGII projects, including energy transition projects in Indonesia, solar-powered development in Honduras, and digital infrastructure investments in Liberia. As President Biden has said, through our work together on PGII, we're letting partner countries and their people see for themselves the concrete benefits of partnering with democracies. Similarly, under the TTC umbrella, we recently announced our joint work to reconnect the unconnected in Jamaica and Kenya, and we plan to expand that going forward. Together with the G7, we've also launched the multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine to enhance our coordination of economic support for Ukraine's immediate and future economic recovery and reconstruction efforts. I could go on and on. There are so many examples. At the International Telecommunications Union, we've worked, especially with our European partners, to develop standards and shared rules of the road on information and communication technologies and to increase digital connectivity worldwide. And in a whole range of multilateral fora, Europe is a steadfast and close ally and partner on protecting and promoting human rights for everyone, everywhere. These initiatives aren't the byproduct of short-term partnerships. At their heart, they are reflections of who we are collectively as a people and what we value. To close, I want to reflect on today's theme that the chairman mentioned, moving Europe from darkness into light. Hearing that, I can't help but think of President Biden walking alongside President Zelensky mere days ago. It was a bright, sunny day in Kyiv. Even with air raid sirens sounding overhead, what you saw was an unwavering commitment to democracy, sovereignty, and unity. While Russia and others have hoped to divide us, to weaken our resolve and the international order that we support, it's instead strengthened us and strengthened it. Today and in the years to come, we must pursue every opportunity to build on that strength, working together as partners and friends with shared democratic values. Thank you again for your ongoing dedication to the U.S.-EU relationship, and I'm excited for our discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks for these introductory remarks and the passionate plea for keeping and strengthening this transatlantic alliance. I think it's now time to have a European point of view. Arancha, would you like to provide one?
Well, thank you very much. When you invited me to a lab, I got a bit worried because these days only unvaccinated citizens or mice are sent to labs. And since I don't belong to any of these two categories, I thought very hard, what should this session be about? So let me just hope that I get this right. It's true that we are living in incredibly dark times. Lots of trends that were there and maybe we couldn't see or didn't want to see have come together, exploded at the same time, and created a new reality that we don't feel in Europe very comfortable with, but that we must respond to. So I think there is 3 areas where we need a little bit of light. And let me try to unpack these 3 areas. Number 1 is in how we describe the present circumstances, the present situation. How do we describe the brutal invasion of Russia of Ukraine? And I would argue that this is about what kind of rules of the game would a more multipolar world have. It's less, in my view, about democracies fighting autocracies or autocracies fighting democracies, but more about what are the rules of the game for this murky, multipolar world that we live in. There is some, clearly, who think that it's about might. And might has the right to decide where the border sits, who has weapons, which organization you belong to, and on which terms you engage with others. There's others, and I would argue that the European Union certainly, given our respiration with the rest of the world, and I clearly hear from Don that this is our common endeavor, who think that a more multipolar world needs rules of the game, needs principles, needs mechanisms to adjudicate when we've got a dispute that is not just simply going back to brutal force. So I think if we characterize it like this, in my view, there are many, many countries around the world that at the moment are not necessarily feeling this is their battle, let's face it, who would feel this is their battle, because they also cannot afford to live in a world where borders are redrawn at leisure or where nuclear threats are issued at leisure. So the first would be, how do we build this new set of rules to govern what belongs to all of us, from international trade to climate change, to the use of weapons, to respect for basic principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think on this one, Europe and America have to work together. It will not be enough, because we are no longer enough, but it will be necessary. Let me go to the other area that requires a little bit of light. And this is something that we in Europe are feeling a bit painful about. If you take the latest analysis done by the European Council on Foreign Relations, the West is very united, but the West is very divided with the rest of the world. And I don't think we can afford this. And I don't think we can sustain this. Which is why I think first we should stop talking about the rest of the world. It's the world. And in this world, there is plenty of countries that today have agency. And they don't want to be dragged into having to choose between one side or the other side, but they want to have the ability to express their views. And we have to create the spaces where these countries that today have agency can express it. And we've got to convince and cajole and care and negotiate and reach compromises, because this is how we will build a new multilateral system, which we need. And I think we need to do this together, because otherwise it's the rest of the world that will not want to be associated with ourselves. Third, and this requires a lot of light in Europe, there is incredible strength that Europe has demonstrated in these last years, whether it's been an epidemic that has grounded us to stand still, whether it's now war in the European continent, and of course we feel this war a little bit more closely than if the war was miles away. This is just a human sentiment. We have shown incredible resilience. We have done things that, when I joined the European Commission back at the beginning of the 90s, I would not even dream of doing, like the Next Generation EU. But we have two areas where today we need to invest if we want to be a bit of a lighthouse in the future: energy union and security and defense. These are two areas where Europe must work to build clear capacities at the European level if we want to have a say in the future. Now, we have shown that to get there we need two ingredients. The first one is leadership, meaning the willingness to do it. We know then when we are confronted with a difficult situation, we find the willingness. We are finding this willingness every time we have to adopt a new package of sanctions against Russia. So the willingness, the deposit of willingness is there. We also need financing, and for that we have also found that we have a way to finance together the investments for the European Union. So, Daniel, hope to put a bit of light, hopefully, and of course, very happy to engage in a conversation, and let me take the opportunity to welcome Don and his colleagues to Brussels.
Thank you very much, Arancha. You remarked, as many people have said, that Europe has risen to the occasion, but it had to rise to the occasion because it didn't act beforehand, right? Or perhaps not only Europe, but many of us didn't react beforehand. And that is perhaps something that we should discuss later on. Many people say Putin expected this and that, and we have done much better. But we shouldn't measure ourselves on Putin's expectations, but on our own expectations, right? Alex, you are now, after a long and distinguished career in many facets of Europe, Dean of the School of, or Director, I think, of the School of Transnational Governance. Right? And when I hear that, maybe I'm asking myself the same question. What is left of global or international governance in this new world?
Well, thanks, Daniel. I actually think quite a lot, and I'll try to piggyback a little bit on what Don and Arancha said. I'll sort of give you my worldview in 5 minutes. It's part of a book that I'm writing, so please don't steal the thesis. So don't tell anyone. So, I mean, in its most simplest form, a lot of us human beings try to find order. So we say that the Cold War was bipolar, it was ideological, it was systemic. The Soviet Union versus the US and their allies. It was quite simple. The US and its allies won the Cold War hands down. Ended in 1989, 1991, depends on how you look at it. Then we entered a phase of unipolarity, which was driven by the US for roughly 10 years. Many of us believed in the end of history that most out of the 200 countries in the world will revert to the best form of governance, which is a combination of liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. This was very much the end of history thesis. I believe that Russia would become a normal liberal democracy. Some people even believe that China would do that because it made sense. I think things started to change somewhere around 9/11. That's when, to a certain extent, we reacted to a serious terrorist and security threat with, one could say, not necessarily very democratic instruments. The world started slowly to become more multipolar, and I think as things moved along, a lot of the values of the liberal world order, norms-based liberal world order, were starting to be challenged. They were challenged in the war in Georgia in 2008. They were challenged in the financial crisis after Lehman Brothers. They were challenged here in Brussels with the Euro crisis. They were challenged by Putin when he annexed Crimea and we didn't do much. They were challenged in the asylum crisis in 2015. They were challenged with Brexit in 2016 and with the election of Donald Trump. And then suddenly, the world became very messy, quite disorderly, multipolar. And I think the nail to the coffin of the old world came on the 24th of February 2022, when Russia finally went for conventional warfare between two states and attacked Ukraine. And as much as I, as a student of international relations, I'm fascinated by the situation. We can't undermine the tragedy thereof. But tragedy, I think, should not, stiffen us up and in a sense, make us... So where are we now? I think we went from a bipolar to a unipolar to a multipolar world. But I think if we look at the world in the following way, it might make sense. I think we have three poles, if you will. We have the global West, which is essentially the US and the EU. We're closer than any time in my adulthood. We're closer than we were, I think, during the Cold War at the moment. And of course, then there are other allies, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. The other extreme is the global East. And I define the global East very narrowly, China and Russia, because they're the two big powers in the system. The global West wants to preserve the liberal norms-based world order, which, by the way, was created in its image post-World War II, in San Francisco through the UN, in Bretton Woods through the IMF and the World Bank, in GATT, which later became the WTO. The world is Western. On the other side, you have the global East, which wants to challenge the old order. They believe in not only pure and simple state sovereignty for themselves, but also in spheres of interest, the power of might and size, and in the preservation of autocracy. Now, this is the systemic battle. This is what Joe Biden calls autocracy versus democracy, or in our case, democracy versus autocracy. And this is what's been very well defined, I think, in the latest strategic review from the US in October, or in the strategic compass of the European Union. But what we fail to see is that the war in Ukraine ignited something bigger. A lot of people thought that, oh yeah, look, the rest of the world is supporting us because 141 states condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly. That is a misinterpretation, just like Arancha said. The rest of the world, or specifically the third pole, the global South, does not support us on this war. The reaction of the rest of the world is to say, this is your war, not ours. It has implications on energy prices, on food security, on inflation. It is not our fault. Do not export your war and your sentiments to us. Does this mean that they're indifferent and unempathetic about it? No, it doesn't. But they are more interested in what the ramifications of this war is. Look, only 39 or 40 countries have sanctioned Russia out of 200. Not one country in Africa has sanctioned Russia, and that's 54 of them. Not one country in Latin America, and only a handful in Asia. The rest of the world is not sanctioning Russia. So for me, it means that the world order is changing. The biggest tension is between the global West and the global East, but the decider is going to be the global South, whether you like it or not. It is not going to be decided by might, power, or economics, but they are the ones who are going to be challenging the rules and want to have a say. And I think the choice for the West then is either we continue our perceived, true or not, slightly arrogant, sometimes colonialist approach to the global South, or then we find a new way of dealing with it. So that's the challenge I think that we're going to have. The EU and the US, will manage, the 28 of us, as I say. but the bottom line is that the global South is going to be the decider. And this is what the war in Ukraine has changed. The rest of the world is not as emotional about the war as we are, and that's for understandable reasons.
There are also some people in Europe who are not so emotional. We had discussed earlier this morning about some countries where the support for sanctions or on Russia or military aid to Ukraine is quite weak.
Yeah, but you know, I still think, you know, Daniel, we have to look at the big picture. And you know, in the Brussels bubble, and I was just at the Finnish permanent representation, there's a tendency to get really excited about Coreper. And I get, you know, excited about Coreper as well. I mean, hell, I was a deputy on Tichy. But the matter of the fact is that I have never, either as a student of European affairs or a politician or a civil servant, seen the European Union more united. I mean, 10 waves of sanctions, the reversal of the peace facility into a military instrument, the waning off from Russian energy, the Green Deal, Next Generation Europe, you name it. I mean, you know, this is like European paradise, right? Just what you have to expect, of course, that it's going to change, because we all know that Europe always advances in 3 phases. First you have a crisis, then you have chaos, and finally you have a suboptimal solution. So, you know, but don't get het up with the small stuff. Orban is always going to be Orban. The big worry I have, if you want to do the small stuff, is the circumvention of sanctions. That's where we should be tougher. When America says, listen, you're going around the sanctions, so we're going to sanction you, Europe finds a way of saying, well, as a matter of fact, it's okay, you can do that.
I have a comment actually on this evasion of sanctions story later, but actually my point was only to say that actually I can understand the people in the Global South saying it's a terrible tragedy, but what's in it for us? And maybe just to take your approach, when we talk about a global order, it must be a global order outside what you call the Global East. Right? You cannot have an order including...
No, I disagree. Sorry.
Okay.
So he's an economist, I'm a political scientist. No, see, what has to happen, I think the way in which I see it, Daniel, is that you have a rules-based world order created in the image of the West based on universal values, which essentially are European or Western values. Then you have a set of public goods that cannot be solved without a global order, which includes the Global East, climate, demography, energy, technology. We can't solve these things unless we do it together. What I'm saying is that it's much better for the West to have the Global South with them in order to try to convince the Global East as well.
Let me give you another example that is maybe a little bit more parochial. It's called debt. Let's look at debt. There is more than 40 countries in a situation of intense debt stress. Out of these 40, half of them are bankrupt, meaning they don't have enough to pay healthcare and education at home. For them, the idea that you're going to invest in the climate transition or in the technology revolution is a very distant dream. Now, who holds this debt? So partly, about 40% is in the hands of public sovereigns, international organizations, US, EU, China. 60%, more or less, give and take, in the private sector hands all across the world. So here is a good example if really we care about ensuring that these countries feel that they are important to us, that in the next months we sit at a table, we, but also China, but also international organizations, but also private sector to discuss debt management. And who talks about debt management talks about international financial architecture. So this, by means of one example that is urgent, that affects lots of countries, and for which the collaboration between the East and the West is either it happens or we will not solve the issue.
Don, I think you have heard a couple of things which would also resonate with your own policy.
No, I agree with much of both what Arancha and Alex have shared. particularly, let's start with that last point. It is absolutely vital for the long-term prospects of the world that we engage in debt restructuring, debt management, and where appropriate, debt forgiveness. It's something that we, I think, in the West are going to have to get behind. And I also think that that's going to require some restructuring of the international institutions that we've relied on to support the financing of more developing nations. I also think, going back to, I guess, the earlier in the conversation, both a mixture of the tripolar world that Alex mentioned and the point that you made rightly, Arancha, about the rest of the world not being separate from us in the West, that we have to think about the world. You go back to where we were. There are specific reasons that the global South, using your parlance, wasn't with us at the start of or during this war this last year. And I attended a meeting of African leaders and CEOs. I think it was a week after President Macky Sall from Senegal, who was also at the time was the chair of the African Union. He had just visited with President Putin. And there is a consistent barrage of misinformation, disinformation, or information. You can choose what you believe about what the West believes and what the West has done, and sort of a pounding on the fact that the West at times has not been particularly good and effective at supporting the development of many countries in the global South. That drumbeat of disinformation has, of course, led to many in the developing world to have a skeptical eye towards the West. It's also the lack of investment from the global West, if you will, in the developing world, or at least investment in the ways that lead to the type of energetic growth that many of the Western countries have realized and despite the fact that we are in difficult times in some parts of the world, many of the countries in the West are experiencing strong economic growth. The opportunity, I will say, for those of us that believe that we can create a world that is based on shared values, on protections of things like worker and human rights, that the global East has also gone about an approach to investment in the global South that I think a large number of folks, maybe Daniel knows the most because he's an economist, would say it's arrested growth, or it's been limited in its impact, and it's saddled these countries with long-term debt that is going to be highly difficult for them to restructure themselves out of. So these are the types of things that the global South is looking at, which model is best for them, and it's no wonder that they would say, we don't want any part of either of them right now. You have to come to us and give us a pathway that makes more sense for us for the long term.
Let me just come back to that question of the Global South. Just wanted to warn the public that in a couple of minutes we'll open also for questions from the audience, and there will be roving microphones around, so prepare yourself mentally. Let's take Arancha's specific case, right, and come back to what you said about an order. For example, now, as you said, China is a major creditor of highly indebted, less developed countries. And now the latest proposal by China is, okay, we take a haircut, but the IMF and the World Bank and international institutions also have to take a haircut, which for us, unprecedented. They never can do that.
You mean in Europe?
maybe one of the reasons for their stance is that we haven't given China really the stake in the IMF and the other financial institutions, which from its pure numbers would deserve. So if you really want to construct an order which includes them on the global issues that you mentioned, they have to be inside.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, and this is the thing. That's why, and many of you will know that I'm one of the most ardent transatlanticists in Brussels. But I do think there's something that I find a little bit uncomfortable with the whole idea of decoupling from China. And I think we have to be careful there, because we have to understand that in order for us to find solutions to common problems, we're going to have to be able to cooperate. Now, how far do we take this? What is the right balance? I don't have an answer for that. Of course, the debt situation in many ways does have a few mirrors to the euro crisis that we had in Europe, and we shouldn't fall into that sort of trap. But my argument is that, and here's where I come to both, I think, Don's and Arancha's point, is that especially the global south needs to have agency, right? They need to have a feeling that they have a say in the institutions. If we start from the top, we take, of course, the UN Security Council, because that is still the most important overarching international institution. It simply does not reflect the world in 2023, especially with P5. Then we start moving from there to other institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and so on and so forth. I'm sure we can find the right balance. But of course, my big fear here is that we start going into smaller games. So we go, instead of the global institutions, we start going purely toward regional ones. I mean, China is okay with multipolarity as long as Asia is unipolar, So you have to be very careful. So I don't know where we take this. I think we can have either competition, which is fine, conflict, which I worry about, but at the end of the day, we need cooperation.
But as I said, we have to invite them in.
In right? One way or another, and it feels quite uncomfortable at the moment.
It's not that we have to invite them in, sorry, they are in. As far as I know, they are part of the IMF and they are part of the World Bank.
Yeah, but the share of China is not exactly.
Okay, I remember two summits in 2009. I'm growing old now. One was Gordon Brown, London G20 summit. The other one was Barack Obama, Pittsburgh, 2009 summit. And it was a moment where we're collectively looking into the abyss. And we got to a deal. And part of this deal was that China would keep its markets open, that it would not engage in rampant protectionism, because that was a precondition, given the pull factor that they have, to get the economy back on track. Now, what China asked at the time was, let's look at the quota and voice of China. By the way, Brazil said the same, Mexico said the same, on the IMF and the World Bank. Now, really, it has to be said, we didn't do much progress on that front. And surprise, surprise, there was such thing called the China Infrastructure Investment Bank that started to take wings.
It's small.
I said it started to take wings.
Comparison to the EIB.
I mean, I'm not judging. All I'm saying is that these countries have agency. But frankly, I wouldn't put Russia into that category, because from an economic and financial point of view, exactly, Russia is minuscule.
Yep.
But China is not.
Right.
Now, we have a choice. They have a choice.
But the European choice was, we don't give up our seats at the IMF. It's a small game, but it's symptomatic of your bigger game. And we can't make room for China. Don, you must be itching.
Yeah, I think that at the core, I want to go back to what Arancha said at the beginning, and that's rules of the road. Yeah. The issue that we've had is that in 2009, and other times we've said, join us, be a part of the world order, so long as you play by the rules. And at times, China in particular has not played by the rules. Now, we can get into a discussion over what the rules should be, what they are and what they should be. But at the end of the day, I think the way that, going back to Alex, to your point, the way that we engage with China, that we work with China, is a recognition that we can't, it's virtually impossible to actually decouple because of the way the global economy works, and that we will have a strategic partnership with them that is based on the rules of the road, and that if they abide by those rules, if they abide by the commitments that they've made, especially around trade, then we will be able to engage with them in, I think, in a collective way and invest in the global South together. But when they don't follow the rules of the road, and this should be applied to anyone, not just China, this should be applied to anyone who is part of that economic world order, we should hold them accountable for not playing by the rules of the road. And I think that's the constructive path forward. Now, we can get into a discussion over, do balloons mean that you're engaging in the rules of the road? But I think that at the end of the day, we in the United States want to have a relationship. We don't want to not have a relationship with China, one that is that we protect our national security interests and our economic security interests, but recognizes that they have their own interests and we can find common ground.
Isn't there, I mean, I think there's a really interesting pendulum or ebb and flow with the two big players of the global East and the global West, so the US and China. Because if you go back only a few years to 2017, right, when Donald Trump had been elected, right? I mean, who flies to Davos, the World Economic Forum, and suddenly becomes the big hero of multilateralism and free trade and a rules-based world order and the fight against climate change? Well, it was President Xi Jinping. And a lot of us in the West felt that, whoa, who are we getting here? This Donald Trump, America first, make America great again type of guy. His language on NATO, he's sort of cuddling with Putin and dictators and autocrats and others. Can you imagine if we had Trump in power now, where we would be sitting, with all due respect, or perhaps not that much of it? But the bottom line is that we'd really be in trouble. Because now with the Biden administration, it's been a completely different game, completely different ball. So 2022 was a really bad year for autocrats, right? I mean, Putin and Xi Jinping. And it was a really good year for Democrats, with a small d, as well, with Joe Biden and the transatlantic partnership. So I think there is this interesting sort of pendulum, and that's why I'm saying, if the pendulum swings between the East and the West, it's so important for the West to engage the Global South. The Global South is not autocratic by definition. It's also not democratic by nature. There is a hybrid form there, but if we play our cards right, I think we can nudge it in the right direction.
Also not homogeneous. I mean,
Of course not.
Africa, India,
yes,
Brazil,
of course
Indonesia.
Yeah, I mean, we humans are not homogeneous. No.
Let me turn to the audience and see, okay, perhaps I'll start here in the, 1, 2, 3, 4th row. There are two hands, which you can keep them both up so that the mic can see you.
Hi, hello.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi,
And please, when you have a question, address them to one member of the panel, because otherwise we don't have time for all the questions.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the panel. I'm Laura. I'm part of the CEP's Young Thinkers Initiative. Then for Alexander, you just mentioned this idea of divide between democracy and autocracy. And my question would be if that is still a relevant division to understand the foreign policy options of the states, or if other variables are more relevant today. Maybe this divide doesn't make that much sense today.
Yeah, I think democracy versus autocracy is a simplification. There is something to it, but I think it's more important to look at, are you for a rules-based world order or not? And of course, democracy is a part of it. So what I'd like to see is not necessarily us trying to export democracy by force, which we have tried to do in Afghanistan or say in Iraq, but do it by way of example. That's how democracies are born at the end of the day. They happen from the inside. So I would look at norms instead of democracy versus autocracy. And I would also look at forms of cooperation. Because to be honest, a lot of people are more interested in food security, energy security, than they are in democracy.
Thank you.
Hi, Philippe Lefebvre from the European Defence Security Summit. I have a question for Arancha. You mentioned a lot how, obviously, Europe shouldn't think about the rest of the world because Europe is part of the world. But do we honestly understand the world from enough of a decenter perspective to engage it effectively? Or are we still fundamentally blind, looking into darkness, assuming what the global south, which I think was mentioned, not a very helpful term, what they want? And if we don't know enough, what steps can Europe honestly take to learn more and become a better and more responsible actor in the world? Thank you.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that I have tried to ban from my vocabulary things like global south and rest of the world, because I think we start there, right? It's how we address others. And I think if there is, if there is an actor internationally that should be able to relate to this very heterogeneous countries, is Europe, because Europe has, at the end of the day, had very intimate relations with almost every region of the world. I mean, I come from a country that, the distance between Madrid and Africa is shorter than Madrid and Paris. But we were part of Latin America, and our sailors invented the first globalization back in the time when they sailed across the Philippines. Difficulties that we sometimes are deaf to the difficulties and the aspirations that others have. And some of the times, we also play our own little games. So we have to elevate a little bit over our little games. Let me give you an example of a little game. I was recently in Latin America, visiting a few countries. And I said, listen, isn't this a good moment to build a strategic alliance? And the answer was with a bit of a very friendly face. Yeah. But are you going to be constant in your interest about us? Or is this going to be a dotted issue? So are we going to be able to finish the EU-Mercosur agreement anytime soon? Or is this for later because you are having your own little quarrels? So it's not that we don't understand the rest of the world. It's that we are consumed with our battles, and we need to be capable in this more geopolitical moment we are living to see our relations with countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Central Asia, with the lens that they are requiring as partners.
I think there was a question first here. Sorry, I'm getting a bit behind. No, it was first here, sorry. In the third row.
Thank you very much. Veronica Ormezzano, independent expert on financial regulation. Two questions, if I may, very quick. One is to Dan. Thank you very much for your very passionate words. Could you tell us a little bit about the looking forward? We hear some tensions within the US, both public opinion and possibly Congress, on support to Ukraine. And so I think it would be really useful if you could elaborate on this. And second, maybe for the broader panel, being from financial expertise, one of the cement of the order is the currency. And we've lived in a world where the dollar was obviously the dominant currency, with some aspiration from the EU to also improve the international role of the euro. But now we see more return to things like gold on one hand, including by central banks, and crypto assets on the other hand. Is that another dimension of this chaos that you were mentioning? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just as a moderator, I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. So the shorter your answers, the more questions I can take.
Very brief. So on your first question, don't believe everything that you hear in the news or on social media. The polling about Ukraine is the exact opposite, as you might have suggested. Overwhelming majorities of Americans are supportive of our continuing effort to uplift the people of Ukraine and to halt Putin's illegal aggression against the people of Ukraine. So our expectation is that despite the sausage making in Congress, what will come out at the end of the day is continued support, just like we have been from day one. And I should probably leave your second question to my colleagues at the Treasury Department, but I'll just say that I think that part of the rethinking of our international institutions has to require the way that we structure these organizations that allows for countries that are developing that have been bankrupted by the systems that have been in place to find for us to build a new system that works for them just as much as it has worked for us. And I think that we shouldn't also overly rely on the government institutions and the international institutions to do a lot of this work. The private sector will get us the type of longevity if we can create the right markets and incentives for or provide information about market opportunities. The private sector can come in and will place a longer-term bet in places like Cote d'Ivoire, where I've spent a lot of time with the Prime Minister, or in Brazil, or in you name your country around the world. So I think that we have to also think about ways that we do a better job of facilitating private investment so that it doesn't always go to San Francisco or to other parts of Europe. I won't single out any particular place.
It is almost 12:15, so I have to ask the permission from my panel if I can go a few minutes, because from the body language I see some people really want to ask a question. And I really ask you to be brief, first there, then over there, and then I come here.
Hello, I'm Eter Glurkiza from Georgia SEP's Young Thinkers Initiative. So Mr. Dunn mentioned the importance of fighting against security threats, common security threats, and so war in Ukraine showed the importance of Black Sea security, and the region is really vulnerable, we see, because of diverse voices and actors there, and especially for Georgia, who has witnessed the war back in 2008. So I'm interested in, after war in Ukraine, how the US sees revised Black Sea security challenges, and what can be the role of NATO, EU, or US-EU cooperation in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take all questions now together.
Yeah, please.
Over there at the end.
Thanks. Heather Graby from Open Society. So the EU now has a competitor for the title of the slowest moving, lowest common denominator crisis response mechanism, and that's the COP process. Now, nobody wants the UN to not have a role in collective action on climate, but we're putting an enormous burden, almost all of it for decarbonisation, on a process which involves all countries, as it should and must, but which is relying on mechanisms that we have never seen deliver, voluntary mechanisms by governments, non-binding commitments, things that can change from one election to the next. How do we get to a better international system for collective action that delivers decarbonisation faster than the European Union could, even for itself?
Hi, I'm Sophia Romansky, researcher for the Hague Center of Strategic Studies. And my question is to Alexander. With Putin's suspension of the New START treaty, what does this mean for the nuclear proliferation regime globally, but also for global governance in the image of the West, the way that you described it? Because it is very easy to interpret this as a direct announcement of we are no longer following your directions. Thank you very much.
Your neighbor there, and then finally there.
Hi, I'm Neil Seidel, researcher at Leipzig University. My question is to Deputy Secretary Graves. where do you, I hate to bring up a new topic, but where do you see the WTO moving in the next 5 years? Maybe Arancha can comment on that as well, if we have time left, which we don't.
Thank you very much.
Marisa Borsboom from Humanity of Things Agency in The Hague. My question is for Arancha and Alexander. The outside eyes and the inside eyes of the perspective of talking about civil society and agency of citizens. What do you feel that Europe is doing towards our own agency as individuals as we grow, avoiding what is the structure of the European Union as such, and different sentiments of European citizens not even understanding how to navigate the European system, or who is actually being in control? In the morning we talk about European Commission becoming European government. I thought it was quite interesting, but if we want to talk about the external world, how do we make sure that our own house is in order and strong?
I propose we do it now in the reverse order. Alexander, you are first.
Okay. 3 points telegraphically. First was the question on currency. I forgot to say in my intervention that read Mark Leonard's The Age of Unpeace. His basic argument is that the things that were supposed to bring us together, like trade, currency, technology, information or energy, they're actually now being used as instruments of power and instruments of war, and can also tear us apart. So that gives a broader perspective. Second, on the Russian reaction on New Start, I would not be given an open checkbook. I think what you have to understand is that the only thing that Putin understands is power, and I've met him a few times, and the only thing that he has left to threaten with is nuclear weapons and creating mayhem and disorder. He used to be able to threaten us with 3 things. One was trade, there is no more. One was energy, there is almost no more. And the third one was military, and that has been quite weak. So now he's using basically his last trump card, which is the New Start. And I do think that we need to have a serious conversation about nuclear non-proliferation in the long run. Third and final point on civil society and agency, it's a very complex question. We try to grapple with it. What I think I'd like to see is democracy 2.0, because the democratic institutions that exist either in nation states or here in Brussels, they were created very much on a model which is quite outdated. We haven't been able to upgrade and update democracy with technology, and that's what we need to do in the long run. But remember, this is a process, and please, just final point, forget utopia. We don't live in one. It's always a process, and we have to try to manage it.
So let me build on that. Montesquieu is very difficult to apply in Brussels. Institutions are very important, and we have learned in these last years how important they are to democracies. But institutions are not enough. You have to create a democratic culture. And democratic culture, a European democratic culture, is not only the job of the European Parliament, the Commission, or the Member States. It's something that has to be lived and alive at the grassroots too. And for this, we are all responsible, not just institutions. On Heather's question, I think the problem we have, COP has been incredibly successful in making sure every country puts on the table the manner in which they will reduce emissions and how will they will contribute to this mammoth task of reducing emissions. But the bad news is that we have not had a discussion about measures that are incompatible. Some countries are taking measures that are incompatible with other countries. And we've seen a little bit of this among ourselves, how measures taken by the US, thumbs up, have a spillover effect on the European Union. And it's these spillover effects that we have not been able to manage properly because we didn't have a discussion on that. So I think... Yet, but this is where I want to make a suggestion to the gentleman on the WTO. This is a conversation that we need to have. I think both of us have an interest in a strong World Trade Organization. Both of us need to work hard to make the World Trade Organization stand for what it should, which is open trade, fair trade, trade that benefits all. That's the task that we need to engage in. And maybe in doing this, we can also have a bit of a discussion about how we will regulate state subsidies, because this is what both are engaged in, and not just both, but also China. So maybe we have a bit of an opportunity to address the climate debate, but also reinforce the WTO in the meantime. Maybe I'm utopian, but hey, someone has to be a bit utopian these days.
Thought that was our job as a think tank to create utopia.
Well, let me start by that answering that wonderful question about the national security threats going forward. I think that what we've all realized over the course of the last few years is that we're only as strong as we are as a collective, and that we have to find ways to build off of the multilateral efforts that we have just been going through to strengthen strengthen international security. And we've also found out something that maybe my friends at the Defense Department or NATO would disagree with, but I don't think so. Economic security is national security, and vice versa. So it's why we've engaged in the sanctions effort and in building a coalition of multilateral partners on export controls. And yes, there's 39 partners in export controls, but the 39 partners are the most important partners for protecting against the types of equipment and technologies from ending up in the wrong hands. So I think we can build off of both the physical, the kinetic security arrangements that we've built, as well as our economic security arrangements for the future. But we have to do it collectively, and we have to start those conversations about what it is that we want it to look like down the road now, because the authoritarian countries of the world aren't going to stop just because we may have some success today or in the coming months at protecting against Putin. And then I would agree on WTO. We have to be very thoughtful about how we restructure the WTO to meet the challenges of today. We know that it is not a fast-moving organization or system. It is not nimble, and there are ways that every organization, or every country rather, is able to use the WTO as a sledgehammer to get at things that are maybe small nails. So we have to find a way to redo the WTO to make it more effective. But it should be the type of organization that we can rely on to create the rules of the road that I think all of us believe are necessary for us to have the type of global order that we'd all like to see.
Thanks a lot, and I must, in concluding, admit complete failure as a moderator, because we have run 10 minutes over time. The lab sessions will start upstairs. You have to walk up officially 2, but I think there's 3 or 4 levels. And you have only 5 minutes to do so. Your coffee break has been taken. Many thanks for the panel.